The wind moved through the gods wood like a careful hand, disturbing nothing, yet the leaves whispered anyway. Snow had settled on the branches of the heart tree and lay along the carved brow in a pale, unblinking crown. Jon stood beneath it with his glove off and his palm against the trunk, the cold scalding and clean. Sap had bled there once, and men swore the face wept. But this night it was only a face of old wood watching him as he watched the breath steam from his own mouth. Ghost stepped through the hush of snow as if he were part of it, leaving faint, almost untrustworthy prints. The wolf's eyes were a deeper white than the snow, pale like cold fire. He pressed himself to Jon's thigh and tilted his great head to look up at the face with him. There was no sound from the castle proper. The smithy's song had long faded. The kitchens were quiet. Even the rookery seemed to hold its breath. Only the wind and the burdened branches and the slow rhythm of a heart Jon tried to name as his. "It is not yours alone," Bran said behind him. Jon didn't startle anymore when his brother's voice came like that, softer than snowfall, out of nowhere and everywhere. He kept his hand on the bark and turned his head. Bran's chair sat where the gods wood path widened, wheels half sunk in the drift. His cloak was a dark pool of wool. He had no hood, as if the cold could not come to him. There was a small smile at the corner of his mouth, something like courtesy worn smooth. "Then whose?" Jon asked, and his voice felt too human in that place. "All that was, all that might be, and the darkness which tries to swallow the thread between," Bran said. "That is the heart. We only borrow rooms in it." Jon took his hand from the tree. The palm was numb now, only the ache left as a memory. "You said you'd show me," he said. "You said there was a way." Bran nodded once, a small tilt of the head, as if agreeing with a thought he'd had some time ago. "There is a cord of ice through him," he said. "It is a nail where his heart was. A shard hammered in and turned until the dragon answered to its shape. But even nails rust when they find salt. Even ice finds something it cannot drink." Jon didn't ask how. He had learned not to expect the whole door when Bran gave him a key. "Viserion," Jon said, and his mouth felt strange around the name, like tasting a stranger's bread. At the name something moved in the tree, or seemed to, only wind ruffling leaves, only snow releasing a small cloth of itself to the air. But Jon felt Ghost's fur rise along his hand. The wolf's ears pricked and he leaned against Jon's leg until bone met bone through wool and leather. "You can reach him," Bran said. "Not as a rider might. Not with reins and spurs and fire's pride. Not yet. But you can follow what is in you that is in him. Your blood knows the road, and your bones know what it means to leave your skin. You have done it without looking. That is all that stands between doing it without looking and doing it while you hold the lantern in your hand." Jon looked at his brother's face. Bran's eyes sometimes looked like the Godswood's pool in summer, the reflection of the sky caught and kept. Tonight they were only eyes, but something had gone farther back in them, to a place beyond fatigue. "If I step wrong," Jon began, "you will be cold for longer than your body measures," Bran said plainly. "You will forget the words for warmth and may never find them again. Or you will bring back something that knows your name but not what it means. Or you will touch him and feel how a wound thinks. And then you will never sleep well again." Ghost pressed closer. Jon's hand found the ridge of the wolf's spine. He remembered what it had been like as a boy to sleep and wake with Ghost's breath in his chest, as if there were no difference between the two of them, as if the world ended at the wolf's nose and started there again each morning. "Better that than the wall burning blue forever," Jon said. His thumb traced a patch where old Scar had made the fur course. "Better that than nothing left to look at but snow black from ash." Bran glanced toward the gate of the Godswood as if measuring a distance that had nothing to do with stone or steps. "She is coming," he said. Jon heard only the wind in answer. He knew Bran was right anyway. Ghost did not move. Dany's footsteps were near silent in snow, a skill learned too late to save anything that had been. She came without attendants and without a cloak at first, her dark hair pinned and heavy with cold. She was not trembling, but he could see where tremor wanted permission. "You left the hall," she said. "Sansa thought it was some offense." I told her you were thinking. Jon did not say what Sansa thought he did. He waited because Dany would come to the name she had not wanted to use and could not help using. Viserion, she said, and her mouth turned around that shape the way he had felt his due. Bran told me. She looked past Jon to the tree. I do not know if I should thank him for that kindness. Jon watched the way her breath drifted away and broke apart. I wanted to tell you myself, he said. You would have said it more gently, she said with the ghost of a smile. He would say there is no gentle in a knife. She looked at Ghost then, and Ghost looked at her. He had never quite decided what to make of her. He accepted her the way he accepted a new season. He thinks I can reach him, Jon said. If I do it where the ice is loudest, he thinks I can find that nail and turn it back. Dany's chin dipped once toward her throat. The winter air had painted thin lines along the edges of her eyes where sleep had abandoned her. If there is a way to bring him home, we must take it, she said. Her voice wavered only at the end. If there is no way, I would rather die on the road to it. He did not say that they might do both. He put out his hand. She hesitated for a breath and then took it, surprising him with how warm she was in that cold. He had expected her to be another thing that fire could not keep. We go east, he said. He is hunting along the coast because there is nothing to eat that does not make noise inland. Tormund and Beric saw him once from a ridge, the light on his neck like glass. The sea knows how to argue with ice, Dany said. If any place will displease the thing inside him, it will be where the water stays loud. We'll need dragonglass, Jon said. Not to kill him, to... He searched for a word for surgery where there had only been war. To pair what shouldn't be there. Bran says it can be done without waking the rest of him. Dany's eyes were on the space beyond Jon's shoulder again, where the heart tree held all words and none. I had a song for him, she said. It was nothing, just a thing I found in my mouth when he was small. I don't know if I remember it. You will, Jon said. Her hand tightened around his. She nodded once. We leave at first light. They left before first light. Dawn had not come so much as surrendered, the horizon giving up a gray that did not choose to be day. The air was the sort that makes the lungs whimper. Sansa saw them off at the gate wrapped in fur and dignity, the latter the heavier of the two. She did not meet Dany's eye, but she laid a hand on Jon's arm and said, Bring them home. And he did not ask who them meant. Arya did not speak at all. She stared at the straps on Jon's saddle, as if there were secrets to be learned from the leather. When he bent to embrace her, she pressed her head to his breastbone, quick and fierce as striking, and then was gone up the stairs as if the keep swallowed her. Bran, wheeled by a boy whose name Jon never learned, sat at the gate and watched. He lifted a hand when Jon looked back. Touching Jon's mind had never felt like anything he could point to, but sometimes after Bran's eyes found his, he would taste pine on his tongue or feel the weight of a raven's bones in the air. Davos was already mounted, cheekbones red-bitten, mustache rhymed. The breath of his horse was a white flag to no one's terms. We'll want the coast roads, he said through the scarf wrapped across his mouth. If road is the word for ground that wishes it were less there. Tormund and Beric are waiting at the last hearth, Jon said. They'll bring us where the watch was thin even in better winters. We'll keep off the low slopes. I want sight lines all the way to the sea. Dany mounted without help and sat as if she had never unlearned it. Drogon and Rhaegal wheeled far to the south. She had felt through her bones when they needed her lately, even before a man came running to say there was trouble with the lines or a bridge where a bridge had been a lie. She had chosen to leave them with the bulk of the army, and it had cut her to do it. And that cut was cleanest because she did not question it. There is courage in setting down a sword, she had said when Tyrion protested. There is wisdom in not putting all you love on one fire at once. They traveled under a sky like steel for 2 days. The snow sometimes came like a thought you could dismiss, sometimes like a quarrel that would be had whether you wished it or not. Davos rode point often. His one glove sometimes raised to show where wind had scoured the drifts thin, or where a creek lay pretending to be more creek than it was. Ghost loped at ease beside the horses. Then far ahead, then behind again as if he did not obey distance so much as rewrite it to suit him. By the time they reached the last hearth, every sound seemed attended by ice. Tamed met them in the yard with a bear pelt over his shoulders and an insult for Davos that would have got a lesser man bit. He embraced Jon hard enough to pop something in Jon's ribs and did not let go for a long time. Beric stood with his hands under his arms and his mouth under his beard and his eye patched and his one good eye steady as a winter star. "He's up there," Tormund said, jerking his chin toward the pale line of the coast. "Comes down to drink the noise of the surf, then goes up again to gnaw on the moon." He wrinkled his nose. "Smells like old iron and bad promises." "Does he hunt?" Dany asked, and the word came out small in that yard, like a creature that required more warmth than they'd given it. "He burns," Beric said. His voice was like wood that had been through 10 winters and still made a fire. "He burns and there is nothing left to hunt, but he cannot eat what he burns. That's the cruelty of it. He has forgotten his own hunger." Dany stood as if struck. Tormund's eyes went to Jon, and there was a hound's pity in them, not unkind. "We don't need to talk until we can," he said. "We'll drink now. We'll talk when the road says the time is its own." They drank enough to be warm and not enough to lie to themselves. The hearth smoke smelled of old meat, and someone had stuffed herbs into it that promised summer in a way that made Jon's chest ache. Ghost lay in the doorway with the patience of snow and watched the room as if the room had offended him once and might do it again. That night, Jon woke with the taste of cold copper in his mouth. He washed it away with water that had wanted to be ice and went to the bleached square of the window. The world had not moved while he slept. He could have sworn the moon was in the same place, looking through the same skein of cloud. Dany was in the corridor when he opened his door, wrapped in a cloak he knew was one of Sansa's. She had her hair unpinned now, a dark spill that tossed shadows. The sight of her unarmored head broke something open in him, and he told himself it was only morning finding his bones. "I thought I remembered the song," she said. "I don't, and then I do. I want to put it in my mouth now so I don't lose it when I need it." "Do it," Jon said. She sang so quietly that he felt it more in his chest than he heard it. The words were not his language, but they were not wholly strange either. They left behind the shape of heat on his tongue, like a cup had been there that had wanted filling for a long time. When she was done, she looked at him as if she'd given away something that could not be returned. He took it up and held it like a small thing that could freeze and tried not to look as if his hands shook. "I'll know it," he said, "when the time comes." "Will you?" she asked, not unkindly. "I'll know you," he said, felt foolish to say it. He said it anyway. She looked at him until it wasn't foolish. "Then you'll know it," she said, and the side of her mouth lifted and then fell again, as if the motion was too costly to keep. He slept in snatches after. When he closed his eyes, he saw a shape moving across a pale field that was not snow. It was more like light refusing some bargain. He felt the edge of a wing as if it scraped the ceiling of his mind. He tried to be a wolf. It was easier to be a wolf. Ghost came like water poured from a skin. It was not stepping into another thing so much as stepping out of the need to be only one. The dark was a place he could drink from. He tasted iron and salt and the old, comforting stink of men. He moved through it with a purpose that had no name but was in the feet. When morning came, he took Bran's counsel in without argument. They went to a spot along the coast where the cliffs let down their guard and the land fell in a slow stare to the sea. The water there never stopped speaking. It spoke in many tongues at once, and the ice could not make all of them shut their mouths. They made a ring of braziers with dragonglass spitted into their hearts like obscene flowers. Davos had the men bank the flames low so the smoke lay like a curtain against the sky but did not go up, and Tormund walked the ring twice, muttering as he did. "Old words," he told Dany when she raised an eyebrow. "Broken as a man's teeth, but they still bite bread when they find it." Beric stood beyond the circle with his sword unlit for once, fingers on the hilt as if it were the only thing he had been allowed to keep since he began losing. "It will not call him like meat calls a wolf," he said, "but it will offend what's in him." That may be enough. What if it offends the rest of him more? Dany asked. Then we will look at that too, Beric said. He did not smile. We have eyes enough to go around. They waited. Waiting was the old trade, older than knights or iron. They did not speak much. The sea did all the speaking that could be stood. A gull came and sat upon one of the dragonglass spears, as if to make a point about the dignity of tools. Ghost lay with his head on his paws and watched the east without blinking, as if he had decided blinking was a poor use of time. Dany stood just inside the ring with her hands clasped at the small of her back and her mouth set as if on iron. Toward mid-morning the light changed without the sun thinking it ought to. The air thinned as if someone had removed the heat of men from it. Davos took his scarf down for one breath and put it back up at once. Up, Tormund said softly, as if to himself, but everyone heard and everyone looked. There was nothing at first. Then a long something where there had been sky. He did not roar. Jon had always thought he would. Even when Drogon came angry and sure, there was noise that told the story of it. Viserion came like a thought you didn't choose to think. He slid along the gray of the morning, and his wings did not beat as often as they should have if gravity had mattered to him. He came down to the ring as if there were no space between where he had been and where he chose to be. The blue in him was not color so much as a decision the world had made. The light in his eyes was not fire. It was not something that wanted to warm. It was hunger after the word for hunger had been rubbed away. Dany exhaled once, the breath of a woman closing a door on a room she had lived in. Jon stepped forward one pace, and Ghost went with him and then stopped, as if he had agreed to go only so far and no farther without new terms. Jon felt the weight of the dragonglass knife at his belt. It had been napped by a boy whose hands had bled doing it. The edge would not be forgiven by anything it met. Don't put the knife first, Bran had told him before they left. Put the name first. Names are first doors. They are also last. Jon said the name and felt it leave his mouth like a small, stubborn bird. It struck the air and fell and then struck again and flew a little. Viserion's head moved an inch as if some old muscle had remembered awake. The blue light shifted in his eyes. Jon could not call that softening. It was more like wind becoming the memory of itself and then wind again. The dragon's chest rose and fell with a rhythm that seemed to have been set by someone tapping a finger on a frozen door. The scars on his neck where the spears had gone in and the chains had bit were black hollows. They looked like mouths that had nothing left to say and still wanted to try. Viserion, Dany said beside Jon. Her voice was not the way she had said it in the quiet of the corridor. It was the voice of a woman in a market in a summer city, the voice she had not had in a long time, the one that had told small things to be patient and large things to be kind. It wasn't the song, not yet. It was the breath before the song. Jon felt something in him lean toward that sound and something in him lean away, as if his body were a house in a high wind. He let the part that wanted to go. He closed his eyes and reached the way he reached for Ghost when the night was too much at once. It wasn't a push. It was a forgetting of a boundary. It was like letting a door that had been set to stay closed stand on its own and see what it did. The first thing was cold. Not the cold that bites the skin. Not the cold that cracks lips. This was the cold you find in the idea of distance. This was the cold of a room left entirely empty on purpose. Jon stopped in that cold and learned the shape of it as if he could put his hands out and find edges. Under the cold was a tarnished gold. He had not expected it. It was not bright. It was not anything a man in a hall would point at and say, "Look." It was a memory of sun in a place where sun had not returned. It had the smell of hot sand and the sound of a girl's laugh and the weight of a small body on a forearm held outstretched until the muscle trembled. Jon had never held a dragon that small. He had never stood in the court at Meereen with flies in the heat and a queen too young to be weary yet. But he knew that shape anyway, as the blind know a face they love by the bones under skin. He reached there because the ice did not know what to do with that. The cold was a mind that liked straight lines. The gold was a memory that refused them. He felt the nail then. Bran had been right. It was not truly a nail, but the mind names what it can. It was in the meat of the memory, and it had found the center of the word that worded Viserion to himself. It had been turned and turned until the dragon didn't remember the taste of what he was without it. Jon did not have a hammer. He had a hand. He put his hand upon the nail, and the nail was winter and a voice that would never be anything but orders. He put the other hand upon the gold, and the gold was Dany's mouth shaping nonsense and love, and the long neck folding to sleep in a ring with the others. Now, Bran said, and Jon had not known his brother was with him, but of course he had always been, because the God's Eye does not say, "This door is not mine," now meant a thing outside of time. It meant that Dany began to sing then. Her voice slid under the cold like wood under ice. Tea did not fight the cold, because you cannot argue a season out of being. It showed the cold a different place to stand. Told the cold, "You do not own this room." The blue in Viserion's eyes flickered, and that was not softness either. It was a candle receiving a draft. Jon pressed his hand harder to the nail and felt nothing, because feeling had no place there. He pressed his other hand to the gold and felt everything at once. He felt the weight of a chain going across a neck, and a heavy jaw laid on a bare foot in sleep, and a tooth lost and grown again, and the first time of meat and the last time of fear. He was not a dragon. He was a man swimming where he shouldn't. He tried to be a wolf for a heartbeat, and the cold saw the wolf and did not know how to hold it. "Hold," Beric said somewhere he was not, and there was the sound of a sword being drawn without flame. Ghost did not move. Jon felt Ghost like a rope around his waist, not pulling, not letting go. The nail turned beneath his hand, almost lazy, as if curious what this pressure was. It had not had to change for a long time. It did not know that change could come without its consent. Jon did not pull. He did not shove. He unlearned the nail as if it were a word he had decided not to use anymore. The gold did the rest, because memory is stronger than command when it is allowed to be. For a heartbeat that might have been more than a heartbeat, that might have been longer than the part of a man that counts, the cold mislaid itself. It stepped aside to look for itself better. Jon felt the nail come free a breath's width, no more. He felt the gold shiver as if in relief and pain both. Viserion's head drew back a little. The blue flame that had been a line along his jaw went dark, and then bright again, and then that same strange dark in which light had not been born yet. The wind chose that moment to come hard. It tore through the brazier's low flames and through the smoke flat. Dany stood within the dark, her hair moving, her face carved in an expression that was not grief and was not triumph. It was patience made hard enough to go to war with. "Viserion," she said, and now the name had the song in it. Viserion hair. The word was old and not one Jon knew, but he felt the sense as if it were placed in his hand. Come, the word meant, not come here or come to me, come back to your name, come back to yourself. The nail did not like that. It twisted as if to dig itself deeper. The gold tamped around it, first gentle, then not gentle at all. Viserion opened his mouth. The sound that came out was not a roar. It was a gasp, as if a lung had remembered it had been a pouch once that hung in the dark and swelled. Blue fire dripped from his teeth like rain. It struck the snow and hissed and went out and left behind holes that did not steam. Davos cursed without moving his lips. Tormund whistled as if to a dog, and then seemed to remember that he did not know that dog's name. Beric lifted his sword and lowered it again. Slow. "Now," Bran said again, and Jon pressed. He pressed with everything he had that was not in his hands. He pressed with the years he had lived being no one, and the nights he had lived being too many, and the morning he had lived that was not supposed to be his. He pressed with his father's lie and his mother's room, and the first time he had seen Dany walk through fire and be only herself at the end of it. He pressed with Ghost's breath against his throat in the dark when he had thought he might never find sleep again. The nail moved. It moved. It did not come out. It did not need to. It moved enough for the memory around it to be itself without apology. Viserion's eyes changed the way a sky changes just before a storm decides it is finished for now. The blue was still there. It would be there a long time. But something else showed underneath it, a tarnished page turning. He stopped moving. That was the first gift. He did not lunge. He did not climb. He did not open his mouth to make winter. He stood with the light inside him, not making choices for a moment. Dany stepped forward until the points of her boots kissed the line of ash where the brazier's breath had been. Jon heard Davos say her name, and Dany did not look to see who called her. She lifted her hand and held it at the height of a muzzle. "Viserion," she said, and now the song did not try to be brave. It only tried to be true. "Viserion, Renar." Nice. It was not a spell. It was a mother finding the shape of an infant's feet with her fingers so the baby would know where to put them. The light inside the dragon flickered like a candle asked to remember. He leaned his head an inch. He leaned it another inch. He did not come to her, but he did not go to the cold either. Jon felt something inside him go weak with relief, and he almost lost his hold that quickly. He gripped with his mind the way a man grips with his hand without thinking, and he felt the nail try to slip back to where it had been. He swore under his breath because the cold did not enjoy words and he wished to spite it. He thought of Ghost running, the ease of each footfall, the way the world seemed made for the length of his stride. He thought of that with all his might, and he felt the gold hold. Memory of running is stronger than order to stay when it is allowed to be. The moment could not last. Nothing ever does, not even mercy. Viserion's head turned by some measure less than the width of a finger, and the blue in him steadied again. He looked at Dany and did not see her. He looked at Jon and did not see him. He looked at the ring of fire and the glass in the fire, and some old anger in the cold recognized an old enemy. "Back," Beric said, and there was fire on his blade at last. A thin, unwilling line licked with breeze. Dany did not move back. She lowered her hand. She did not look away from Viserion, though the wind had begun to pull her hair in her eyes. "It will not be today," she said quietly, or Jon thought she said it quietly. Then he realized she had not spoken at all. He understood her regardless. Viserion drew in breath. Jon felt it as a gathering of winter from 100 places at once. He raised his hand without thinking, and the dragonglass knife came into it with the surety of old use. He did not mean to throw it. He did not mean not to. He only meant to make the shape in the air that said a hand was here that would not be told. Ghost rose in one smooth motion and stood half astride in front of Jon, and the hair along his back made a ridge like a snowed hedge cut by a careful gardener. The dragon loosed the blue. It came the way a word comes that has been waiting. Curved and hissed and leapt, and the wind did not move it. It struck the line of ash and made glass. It struck the places where the braziers had burned and made them into bowls that would not hold anything. It did not cross the ring. It licked the circle and went up and made a pillar that screamed and then fell apart in silence. The heat of it was a heat that did not honor the name of heat. Jon felt nothing. He saw his breath anyway. Viserion's chest fell. He made a sound then that might have been a memory of a roar. He lifted himself with less difficulty than a hawk chooses sky, and he was up. He was gone without haste and without hurry both. The sky stitched itself closed behind him and pretended it had never been unmade. No one spoke for a long time. The sea went on speaking as if it had been away on business and had just returned to find they had all behaved poorly. The glass along the ash line cooled with a sound like a laugh no one knew the joke to. Dany turned to Jon finally. Her mouth was the mouth of a woman who had smiled too much in the past and not enough lately. "He knew me for a breath," she said. "Do not lie to me and say he did not." "He did," Jon said. He put the knife back in his belt and his hands were steady now. "He knew you. He knows you still." She nodded. "We will come again," she said. It was not a question and it was not courage. It was simply a sentence made of choices. Tormund snorted out a breath and rubbed at his beard as if worried he had lost something in it. "He didn't hate you as much as he could have," he said. "That's good for a start." Davos squinted at the line of glass as if trying to see a road in it. "When we come again," he said, "we'll come with more than songs and knives. We'll come with what the cold dislikes most." "What is that?" Beric asked, and there was something like wonder in his voice, as if he had never met anything the cold disliked and was eager for the acquaintance. "Contradiction," Davos said drily, "and patience. and more fools who don't know when they're beaten. The sea will lend us some. It dislikes being told. I've noticed. Jon went to the edge of the circle and crouched and touched the glass with the tips of his fingers. It was not hot. It was not anything. It was like touching a thought that had been only half thought and then put away. Bran's voice came very far and very near at once. He is not a door you open once, he said. He is a house where rooms have been shut for many winters. You have unbarred one. That was a good room. There are worse rooms. Do not open those by mistake. Jon stood and looked at the sky and saw nothing but the admission that it had held something and did not wish to say what. Dany came and stood beside him. She did not take his hand because there were eyes and because some things are gentler when they are not held. He was grateful for that gentleness. They turned back toward the last hearth when the light began to go thin in a way that promised either snow or something that wanted to be snow. Ghost trotted ahead with an air that said he had made a list and would be checking it twice along the road. Tormund told a story about a seal that tried to marry him, and Beric laughed once as if someone had forced him to and had done it well. Davos rode with his shoulders high to his ears as if he hoped to hide them from the wind. Dany fell back beside Jon when the road narrowed. "Do not let me be impatient," she said, voice low. "If there is a way to call him home by slow degrees, let me learn those degrees." "You can teach me patience then," Jon said, because it was easier to take the jest out of himself than to do anything else. "You are patient enough when it is a matter of other people's lives," she said. "It is your own you have trouble being kind to." She looked at him as if to apologize for a gentle cruelty and then did not. "I want my child back," she said. And there it was, the naked thing that breath fogged and could not quite obscure. "I know," Jon said. He thought of the nail and the way it had shifted and the way the gold had flinched and held. He thought of rooms in a house. He thought of Dany singing a song whose words were older than her and the way the name had made the air a little warmer for a breath. He thought of the Night King's hand as a thing that could be pried loose finger by finger if a man were stubborn and loved enough and willing to be colder than any winter he had been promised. He did not say any of that. He only said, "We'll go back." They went back. Winterfell received them like a home that had not decided if it would be kind. Sansa's eyes flicked from Jon to Dany to Davos to Ghost and counted and found the numbers right. Arya looked into Jon's face as if to see what room in him had been opened and whether it was one she had known as a child. Bran's mouth did not move, but somewhere in the edge of Jon's vision a raven landed and shook out its feathers and watched with one bright pin of an eye. There were councils after that and maps that grew greased along the edges from too many hands and a list of supplies that ran like a prayer you didn't trust. The fires in the great hall burned with a sound like low talk. Men and women came and went from the solar with their shoulders lifted with purpose and lowered with fatigue. The words dragonglass and sens and tides and cliffs and hunt became a language of their own that no one loved and everyone had to keep speaking. At night, Jon went to the Godswood with Ghost and the ache of a nail he did not own under his hand. Sometimes he went alone. Sometimes Dany came with him and stood with her hand on the bark and her eyes closed and the quiet in her face a thing he wanted to keep in a small box where moths couldn't get at it. Sometimes Bran was already there as if he had never left. "You cannot take him all at once," Bran told them once when the moon was a bright coin men would have killed for in another world. "The thing that owns him loves all at once. It does not love slowly. That is its weakness, not its strength." "What does that mean?" Dany asked, not willing to accept riddles when what she wished was a map. "It means that hunger is foolish," Bran said. "It rushes. It does not know how to wait. You do." "We pretend to," Jon said, "because honesty is a habit and sometimes it is a bad one." Bran tilted his head. "Pretend long enough and it becomes another word for endure," he said. "Most virtues are only habits that were not abandoned." Melisandre returned when no one had asked for her, as if drawn by a magnet that cared nothing for the wishes of iron. She came on a day when the snow fell like ash and left the room smelling of smoke for a long time after she'd gone. Ser Davos looked at her as one looks at a fire that has burned a friend and still keeps a man alive. She looked at Dany as if she had been expecting to find her this age all along. As if the girl on the red waist had been a stranger she was glad to be wrong about. "You will need the name of warmth," she told them by the long table where the rivers of the north had been carved and repainted too many times to look like water anymore. Not the common name, not the word men say to each other around a hearth. The name that opened the first fire and taught the second to envy it. Davos snorted. "And will you be selling names at fair prices in the yard?" Melisandre ignored him with the grace of a woman who had ignored princes. "You have 1 foot in snow and 1 in ash," she said to Jon. "That makes you clumsy. Learn to be proud of it." She turned to Dany then. "And you," she said, "must learn to love a colder fire." Dany smiled very slightly. "He will teach me," she said without looking at Jon. "Or he will learn from you how to fall without breaking," Melisandre said. "There are more teachers than pupils in this room." They went again to the coast and again. The sea never grew tired of arguing with the cold. It sent its edges up and took them back and sent them up again. Viserion came when he chose and not when they called. Some days the ring of glass reminded him of something that annoyed him less than everything else, and he landed within sight without anger. Some days he turned in the air and ripped 2 men from their saddles with wind alone and was away. He never came to Dany. He no longer went entirely away from her either. Jon learned the House of Rooms that was Viserion's mind in the slow, humiliating way men learn anything worth knowing, 1 mistake at a time, then another mistake he would not make again, then a success that came out of the wrong door and made him revise what he thought a door was. He found rooms that were only ice and rooms that were only gold and rooms where the 2 argued and rooms where the argument had created something else. He learned to leave closed what should be closed. He learned that memory has a tendency to open its own doors when one is not looking. He learned to be a wolf when ice tried to make him a man. Dany's song changed. At first she had tried valor, and then she had tried sorrow, and then she had tried command. None of these had done more than make the cold look at her with contempt. When she stopped trying to shape the sound into a weapon and let it be only what she remembered, the cold spent too long deciding what to call it. In those moments, the nail turned. The North watched. It did not approve and did not disapprove. The North has no patience for many things and has infinite patience for what decides to continue being itself. The folk in the villages along the coast learned to read the sky the way fishermen do and shepherds and men who have spent too long at war. They pulled their sheep into the byres twice as often and salted their nets with the seriousness of men baptizing something that needed it. They gave the party from Winterfell shelter when shelter was what dignity could bear, and they gave them a quick meal, and they gave them gossip with both hands. Tormund drank anything put in a cup as if hoping the taste of each would remind him of something he had liked better. On a day when the cold had come down from the hills without anger and only with purpose, Jon stepped into the room where the nail was and found it missing. He almost shouted aloud. He almost opened doors he was not supposed to. He held still. Holding still is a thing the winter teaches, and he had had good teachers. He looked at the place where the nail had been and found a scar. He put his hand on the scar. It was not warm. It was not cold. It was the temperature of truth. Viserion's head moved down another inch. His nostrils flared. Dany had not sung yet. She put out her hand, and there was nothing between her palm and his jaw but air. Jon heard a sound then, not with his ears. It was a sound the size of a heartbeat and a house and a season. It was a sound of something deciding it had been wrong and would like to be wrong differently. The blue in Viserion's eyes softened for as long as it takes a man to decide not to lie to a friend. Dany's fingers trembled and did not, because sometimes a body obeys the person inside it and sometimes it obeys the person it wants to be. Her hand touched him. He was cold. Of course he was cold. He was also not as cold as he had been. "Viserion," she whispered, and the word left her mouth and did not fall like a bird this time. It flew and came back and sat, shy, on her shoulder. Viserion exhaled through his nose. The breath steamed in a way that argued with the season again. He did not close his eyes. He did not know how. He stood with his mother's hand upon him and did not destroy anything. The sea lifted and fell. The ice made its long complaint. Men drew breath they did not know they had been holding and released it. John felt Ghost lean into his leg and knew that the wolf had done as much here as any of them, simply by being the thing he refused not to be. The moment passed because moments do. Viserion lifted his head away from Dany's hand with the care of something not wanting to break anything. The blue steadied again. He unfurled his wings and became air. He went up and was a long, dark thought written across a gray page. Dany stayed with her hand held out as if something were still there and could be relied upon to be heavy. Her mouth parted and closed. John put his hand lightly around her wrist and lowered it. Not out of command, not out of leadership, only out of kindness, the way one does a friend who has forgotten where her arm is. She turned to look at him with eyes that had been winter for so long they had forgotten it had ever been summer. He saw the ember there. He had not put it there. He wanted to keep it from wind anyway. "We'll come again," she said. He nodded. "Until the room opens and stays open," he said. "Until he knows his own name without us telling it to him." She smiled then, a small, dangerous thing that made winter seem less certain in its plans. On the ride back, snow began to fall with the gravity of a decision bay. Written down, Davos hummed a song from White Harbor that had too much salt in it to be respectable. Tormund listened and shook his head and said, "That song should be attacked and put in chains," and hummed along after. Night came the way it comes when it has nothing to prove. The moon climbed and watched them through the rags of cloud. Ghost ranged wide and then came back and put his nose against Jon's knee as if to remind him that bodies are good things to be in, and then moved off again to tell the night what belonged to whom. When they reached the last hearth, there were ravens on the parapet. They looked like punctuation against the snow. One of them turned its head and watched Jon until he felt the eye like a ring placed around his heart. Bran's voice came from the dark idea of the bird, that clean, almost impersonal tone of care. "There are other rooms," Bran said, "and there are rooms in you. Some are locked because they should be. Some are locked because no one has asked them nicely for a long time. Be careful which keys you borrow." Jon grunted, which was the sound a man makes when a truth he does not want offers him a chair. He rubbed Ghost's ears and felt the heat of him. He thought of Dany's hand against cold and the way she had refused to shiver. He thought of ice changing its mind for a moment. He thought of a nail that had moved and now was a scar. He slept then, and his dreams were not his. He ran through snow with a body that knew what it was for. He hovered in an air that did not care to hold him and held him anyway. He stood in a hall where men argued and the faces of the statues looked down with patience. He stood at a window where a hand that might have been his, but older, and a different father behind him, reached out and closed it against a song the wind had been trying to sing. Morning found them. Morning always finds what does not hide too well. There was porridge that tasted like wood but was hot, and a boy with a scar that ruined nothing handed Jon a mug with both hands because he had not learned how to do it any other way. Dany sat with her elbows on the table and did not eat and then did. Tormund told a joke that made no sense except that he laughed at the end, and that made it work. Beric watched the window the way men who have died watch anything that lets light through. "We're not winning," Davos said when they were alone with maps again. "We're not losing. We're spending. I don't know what the currency is, but we're spending something." "Time," Jon said. "Men," Davos said. "Songs. Hope. Perhaps we have more of all those than I thought. Perhaps we have less." Dany looked at the line of the coast as if she could see the sea through the wood. "We have him," she said, "even if we only have the breath it took to say his name." "That is a coin the cold does not know how to count," Davos admitted, rubbing at his mustache. "Let's see if we can make a fortune out of it." Jon put a finger on the map where the ring of braziers had been, knowing the map did not care and loving it anyway for the way it tried to pretend the land had rules. "We'll go again," he said. "The next time he feels hunger for something he can't name." "And what if he learns to name it?" Dany asked very softly. "Then we'll give it to him," Jon said. "Not all at once. Not in a way that hurts anyone we can help. But we'll give him back his own name until it stays." He did not say what stood between them and that staying. That list was long and had teeth. It had a crown of ice at its head and faces of men, they had once sat with and faces of men they had once been. It had winter and it had human weakness and it had the simple, brute fact of distance. It had everything that had ever stopped anyone from doing something lonely and necessary. Ghost put his head on John's thigh and closed his eyes and reminded him that loneliness can be kind if you let it. Outside, the snow lifted and fell and lifted again, and the sky thought about clearing, and the sea kept arguing with the cold as if it had been hired for the task. Somewhere far off a shape moved across a pale field and thought about a song it did not know the words to yet, and a scar refused to be a nail again, and a name waited to be called and to answer in the same breath. Snow held the fields like a breath. Days opened and closed like the lids of a tired eye. The cold kept its arguments with the sea, and the sea kept answering, and men learned to live on the margin of those disputes because there is no other place to live. Winterfell's chimneys smoked and sometimes did not, and when they did not, men told each other it was because the woodyard was prudent, and when they did, they told each other it was because the world had not become entirely foolish yet. John moved through those days as if they were rooms. He learned the routes between them, where the floor tilted, where the drafts lived. He learned which hour was best to sit with maps when Davos was talkative, and which hour to stand on the wall alone when thought needed to be a thing with a single set of shoulders. At night, he climbed into the rooms behind a dragon's eyes and tried to leave the doors he had learned shut, and sometimes he failed and sometimes he did not. In the mornings, he found himself holding a cup in the hall and not knowing whether he could drink. The cup steamed. The world required small obediences as well as large ones. He obeyed. Sansa reigned without pretending not to. She measured flour with one hand and gossip with the other, and both were weighed true. She had men's ears because she did not waste them. She had their fear because she wasted nothing. She did not love Dany and did not lie about it. She did not hate Dany and did not lie about that either. She spoke to Jon in sentences that were stoutly built and could carry weight. The small folk on the eastward farms, she told him one afternoon while the fire threw sparks up the chimney as if arguing with its own smoke, have buckets of brine in their doorways now. They leave them out so the wind will stumble into them first. It's nonsense, but nonsense makes a man brave sometimes. Let them keep the buckets, Jon said. Salt has memory. Sometimes memory is a weapon. Sansa looked at him as if he had offered her a riddle and a loaf of bread at once. You will do this as long as you breathe, she said. Go back to him. Go back until either he comes home or you do not. I will, Jon said, and he meant it with the simple clarity of a man vowing to return a borrowed tool. I will. Arya passed through the great hall like weather, noticed only when she chose to be. She had taken to watching the ravens the way a cat watches a mouse that may become a rat. Once, by the broken well in the courtyard, she said to Jon, if there is a place where he is only blue and not himself at all, don't go there. I'll try not to, Jon said. Try harder than that, Arya said. She was not smiling when she said it. She rarely smiled now unless violence had turned out to be unnecessary. And then she smiled with a small, private joy that made men love her without knowing they did. Sam came in with frost in his beard and a book under his cloak as if it were a child, and both needed saving. He had with him Gilly and little Sam, who was not little anymore but had kept the name like a charm, and when the boy saw the yard he ran to throw snow at Ghost, and Ghost submitted to the insult with gravity. You don't write, Jon said, and then they were embracing and the book fell and both men almost fell after it. I wrote, Sam said into Jon's shoulder. I wrote too much. No one delivered it because everything a man carries becomes either food or fire between Old Town and here. I brought what I couldn't burn. He patted the book with almost superstitious tenderness. This speaks of something called keening glass. It is obsidian cut thin and set to sing. Sing, Dany asked from across the hearth. She had not risen when they entered. She was teaching her body to remain where it was placed and not fly to every noise. In the old tongue, Sam said, cheeks coloring just slightly because he had not yet decided if he loved being listened to by a queen. Not Viserion, older, basalt pipes and the bones of something long dead to carry the note. The glass vibrates, well, the text says it weeps, and things inside anything that does not belong to the world do not like it. They come loose because the world is being itself too loudly. Davos stroked his mustache as if it were a familiar that might offer counsel. "We can make pipes," he said. "We can blow them and scare the shit out of every seal between here and Skagos. If it shakes something foul in a dragon as well, I'll be proud to offend the sea." Melisandre, who had been standing very quietly near the hearth with the stillness of a woman accustomed to catching men in the act of underestimating her, inclined her head. "Bones are easier to tune than men," she said. "We'll need dragon bone. A sliver will do." "We haven't any to hand," Davos said. "I've spent my life avoiding the part of the world that has dragon bone lying around." Dany's hand came to her throat and then fell. "Drogon shed a spine on the ridge north of the Wolfswood," she said, as if reciting a fact. "Regal dropped 2 teeth in a skirmish with whites near the Weeping Water. The men collected them and I told them to bury them. They did not." "Then we have the makings of a choir," Davos said dryly. "Gods save us from music." They worked. Winter does not admire industry, but it does not forbid it either. Men took obsidian to the smiths who had not asked to learn this shape and learned it anyway. They found the old quarries where the children of the forest had pulled glass like night out of the ground and laid it down in shapes that calmed their minds. They made bowls of brine and set them around the pipes because Sam's book mentioned salt as if it were a tutor to the song. They stood on the cliff like unmusical priests and blew and listened to the wind, trying to pretend it had not been moved. The first attempt with the keening glass made the ring of braziers whine as if a dog were complaining. The second cracked 3 pipes and drove 2 men to their knees laughing at nothing. The third brought Viserion out of a mist that had not known it would be asked to deliver anything. He came from the north this time. He came low over the sea the way a blade comes low across a wrist. Jon had learned to be ready without looking as if he were. He had learned to keep his hands still when everything in him wanted them to reach. He had learned that desire has a scent and dragons do not dislike it, but they do not respect it either. He took his place just outside the ring of brine bowls that smoked very slightly as if embarrassed. Dany stood opposite him. Between them, the keening glass set up its thin, tireless sob. Viserion landed badly and made it look deliberate. His foreclaws bit into earth that did not love being bitten. The blue within him stayed steady except when the wind fancied something and shook it. He smelled like iron left out under rain no one remembered. He turned his head toward the pipes as if listening to a man failing to lie. "Now," Bran said from a distance that had nothing to do with feet. Jon closed his eyes and went where the rooms were. The house inside Viserion had changed. The room with the scar where the nail had been was brighter. That was not the right word. It was less ashamed of being what it was. A staircase that had once been blocked by a drift stood half clear. Far beyond, where the air lay like glass, there was a corridor made of winter, perfectly straight, and at the end of it a figure that was not a figure, a weight that was not a weight. Jon looked away in the way one looks away from the mouth of a well. The corridor noticed and noticed that it had not been granted reverence, and a sliver of old anger moved along it like wind under a door. He did not go there. He put his hand upon the scar, and the scar knew him. Not with welcome and not with surrender. With a tired recognition that had decided, for now, that he had a right to be where he was. Dany's song came in not as command and not as plea. It came in as a habit, the sort a mother has of humming while her hands work. It left warm places in air that did not deserve it. The keening glass shivered along the walls of the rooms and made the winter places clench with dislike. Jon felt the scar ease another fraction and the floor under his feet list as if memory had shifted its weight. Viserion's eyes glanced. That was what it looked like from outside. A glance like a proud beast refusing to stare where it wanted to. On the cliff, his jaw unclenched. Blue fire gathered and then guttered without leaving his mouth. He lifted his head as if a scent had guessed his name. Dany stepped forward. She did not reach yet. Her hands hung at her sides, palms visible. He could count the veins that braided her wrists. Ghost stood between Jon and the dragon and then moved aside with a small flick of his ear, as if acknowledging that the law of the moment had changed. "Viserion," Dany said, and now the word had no music in it at all. It was a piece of bread laid on a table where someone starving might sit down. "Viserion," she said again, and John felt the stair he had not climbed settle into a lesser angle. Viserion closed the inner lid of his eyes and opened it again. It was so small a sign that only a woman watching him, as if she had made every part of him, would have seen it. She saw it. Her breath went out in one ribbon, to show someone she had not stopped breathing. Then the air changed. The cold came down out of a cloud that had not been there a breath ago. Came like policy. It had decided the time for argument was done. The brine bowls hissed. The pipes sang a note that bent toward silence and refused to kiss it. Beyond the ring, on the white plain above the tide, figures rose like weeds through frost. They did not run. They had no reason to hurry. Beric lit his sword as if embarrassed to be caught without a shirt. Tormund swore in a dialect that might have been his and might have been invented for the purpose. Davos took off his glove, spat on his hand, and put the glove back on as if that were a sacrament. "Hold him," Bran said, and Jon did, not with force, with attention. The house behind Viserion's face jolted as if the foundation had been shoved with a tree trunk. A door at the far end of a hall opened with a sound like frozen cloth tearing. Jon could see, through that slit, a place that was only white, but whiteness with intent, whiteness that had nothing to do with light and everything to do with judgment. He took a step toward it and then stopped because Ghost's teeth were in his sleeve, and Ghost's weight was a law older than winter. Dany saw the figures coming and did not look away from her son. "Not yet," she said to no one and to everyone. "Not yet, not yet." She put out her hand and now she reached. She reached like someone trusting a ladder across a ditch she was not certain of. Her fingers touched Viserion's jaw again. They stayed. He did not lower his head. He did not close his eyes. He allowed the touch as if indulging a custom that did not offend him enough to end. Jon felt the scar flush under his palm, a sensation without temperature, like guilt. The dead came to the circle. They stopped where the brine bowls steamed faintly, like men arriving at a property line they had not expected to find. They looked with the dead man's lack of looking. Behind them, farther out, the air grew thick. It thickened into a moving thing. It moved with conviction and the indifference of ice. Beric took one step into the brine and swung the sword in an old line that cut the wind and introduced it to fire. 3 of the things at the front faltered and then came anyway. Tormund's axe made a room around him where obedience to cold was cancelled. Davos shouted something nautical and unrepeatable. The pipes went higher, thin as hair and as stubborn. Sam was on his knees with his hands on the largest bowl, as if he were prepared to wrestle salt. Melisandre stood very still and said nothing out loud for the first time since Jon had known her. Dany's hand stayed. The thing in the thickened air revealed a limb. It made a spear out of weather, pulled back to throw. Regal came shrieking, the sound of a temple object being struck and struck again until it remembers it was meant for music. He stooped out of cloud like a hawk that had been insulted. The spear met his wing and glanced off, throwing blades of frozen air into the surf, and the wave rose with a sound like men in a bad mood, and the surf accepted what had been thrown into it and broke it up and spat it back under other names. Drogon followed a wing length behind his brother and laid fire across the thickening as if signing a contract. The fire didn't like the air. The air didn't like the fire. They did not agree to anything except to make a more complicated weather. Viserion lifted his head under Dany's hand. He barked a single, ugly note, like iron on iron. He turned his face away from her and looked toward the storm as if listening for a command. Jon felt the corridor at the back of the house brighten, which meant it grew emptier. He did not go there. He pressed his hand into the scar until the idea of a hand was all that existed. "Come back," Dany said quietly. "If you must go, come back." Viserion's body did the intelligent thing it had been made to do. He left the ground with the contempt for gravity that made dragons dragons and not large dogs. He did not flame. He moved through the fight without touching it and went up and was a small problem on the sky. Dany's hand fell. She did not wipe it on her cloak. The dead came as far as the brine and then could not remember why they had wanted to cross. They stood there with the patience of rocks. The thickened weather moved on, taking its spear-making elsewhere. Regal circled, offended and proud. Drogon said a word in fire that Blue refused to learn. Beric lowered his sword and the light went out of it like thought leaving a room. Keening glass, Davos said, panting into his scarf. And brine, and 3 fools and a prayer. We can do worse. We have, Tormund said cheerfully, breath smoking. And we will again. They went back to Winterfell with the understanding that victories are sometimes confusions whose bills have not come due yet. Dany walked beside Jon the last mile and said nothing until they could see the high gate through a shiver of snow. Then she said, "He lifted his head because I asked him to, or because I touched him. I cannot tell which, and I hate that I cannot tell." "It matters," Jon said, "but not today. Today it matters that he did it." She nodded, one clean tilt. "I will learn to love a colder fire," she said, and Melisandre, passing them with her hood up and her mouth align, looked aside as if to say yes. That night Jon dreamed of the house and woke to find himself sitting in the God's Wood with his back against the heart tree and Ghost with his head heavy on Jon's knee. Snow had layered on Jon's shoulders and melted to cold water that had gone into the cloth and decided to stay. He brushed it off and listened to the tree not speak. Bran's chair was there, the marks of the wheels in the drift like writing no one had taught him. "You stepped into the corridor," Bran said from the path, as if uttering an hour later the thought Jon had had in his sleep. "You didn't walk there, but you leaned toward it. And it noticed," Jon said. He did not bother to ask how Bran knew. Bran had been sitting with ravens again. Their prince nicked the snow like punctuation. "It noticed that I do not love it. It does not wish to be loved," Bran said. "It wishes to have no competition. Then it will be unhappy a long time," Jon said. Bran smiled with the portion of his mouth that used to smile as a boy. "Good," he said. "Let it practice a new emotion." Word came from White Harbor of ships out past the bar, the sort that did not float so much as loiter. Men in the south would have said raiders. In the north they said weather with steel. Sansa sent a raven back with instructions sharpened like knives and then a second raven softer because bread also feeds. She sent one to the Manderleys as well, written in a hand that had learned never to blot itself. She sent food. She sent lines of credit written on Winterfell's honor. Money holds heat if you keep it close long enough. Arya took 3 men and a girl with arms like wire and went along the coast. She returned with 6 men and the girl, and 2 of those men had blue at the edge of their eyes that had not yet decided to be blue. Melisandre laid her hands on their faces and said nothing, and afterward they cried, and Arya stood with her back to the room as if lending them privacy. Ghost licked the salt off the girl's wrist and looked at Jon afterward as if to say, "This was worth the trouble, was it not?" They built a second circle of pipes and a third, because men who have seen something work wish to see it work again and then better. Sam tuned the glass with the solemnity of a novice monk entrusted with the bell at vespers. The smiths learned to thin the blades to the thickness of a stubborn leaf. They hung them on frames of ash wood and listened to them complain to the wind until the wind began to complain back and then give in and sing with them. On the day they went to the cliff with all 3 circles assembled, the sky had chosen to be indifferent. Indifference is not kindness. It is only an absence of malice. Jon told himself that was enough for an afternoon. He stood in the inner ring with Dany and Melisandre and Ghost. Davos and Tormund moved among the outer rings like men responsible for a fair that might attract too many visitors. Beric stood with his sword unlit, hands at rest, the line of his mouth the line of a man who has wept and resented it and would do it again without hesitation. The first notes from the outer frame went up and Jon felt the hair on his arms salute. It was not a song so much as a stubborn argument with air. The second ring answered in a different key, higher and more petulant, and the air conceded nothing and then a little. The inner ring began very soft, like a person humming behind a door. Dany did not open her mouth yet. She held the song inside her until it had weight. Viserion came from the west this time, over the land, as if to say he respected no pattern but his own. He came lower than he had ever come, feet skimming the snow like a man dipping his boots in a river to cool them. He smallened the sky around him by knowing it too well. He saw the frames and did not despise them. He saw the rings and did not love them. He landed. The blue in him had a shadow at its center like a pupil remembered. Jon did not reach too fast for hope. Hope was a nerve you could damage by grabbing at it. He went into the rooms quietly and took off his shoes and left them by the door as if visiting a friend who did not like the sound of heels on tile. Inside, the corridor of winter was quieter. That was new. The scar room had changed again. The scar had grown, no, not grown, but woken. It had begun to be more than a mark. It had begun to assert itself as part of the architecture, not an injury inflicted on it. He put his hand there and felt, for the first time, a sensation that was a cousin to warmth. Not heat, not temperature, permission. Now, Bran said, but the word meant something different today. It meant, do not do more than this. Dany opened her mouth. The song was almost nothing. It was what a woman sings to herself when laying cloth to dry. It was what a girl hums to keep the rhythm while brushing a beast that likes its ribs scratched. Carried no announcement. It was not designed to be understood by anyone who didn't already know it. Viserion's head tilted, and not like a hawk thinking of meat, like a creature thinking of sleep. Dany stepped until her boot toe nudged the edge of the brine, and then stepped into the brine with the indifference of a queen to cold. She put her hand to his jaw. She laid her brow there as well. She stayed like that for the space it takes to remember a life. Jon held the scar with his mind until his legs wanted to give and Ghost pressed against him, as if to keep him in the world of gravity a little longer. Behind them, the world remembered it was at war. Shapes in the snow that had been snow and were now men stood up. Not many, not enough to panic an army, enough to alter the temperature of a human room. Beric's blade drew flame as if from the idea of fire alone. Tormund's laughter was a bark that made the dead look at him as if judging his taste. Do not let go, Bran said. Jon did not. He had no hands left to do it with anyway. Both were on the scar, the one in the dragon and the one in himself that matched it. He felt something else move then, low and clumsy and honest. It was not the corridor. It was not the ice. It was a memory of a boy dragging a length of chain because it had been put on him and he did not know that he did not have to keep dragging it. It was the first name Dany had given him, not the last. It was the understanding that meat was good and fire was good and sleep was best when your brothers kept your head warm. Viserion lowered his head. Not entirely. Not the abasing bow of an animal offering itself. Enough. Dany's brow pressed hard against bone. The blue in his eyes moved like weather clearing a mountaintop. Jon felt something catch and then release, the way a tooth that has been loose finally decides. He made a small sound without meaning to, and Melisandre's hand flicked out quick as a snake and steadied his forearm as if catching a cup before it spilled. The dead reached the brine and then remembered the sea and what the sea does to the arrogant. They hesitated and the hesitation became confusion and the confusion became collapse. The ones behind stepped on the ones in front, the way water steps on water, and the shape they made was a river of unwillingness. Davos barked a laugh that sounded like a rope tightened and then released. Beric lowered his sword with a small sigh a man makes when a chore finishes sooner than he had prepared to tolerate. Dany lifted her head at last. Her face had salt on it, and no one could say whether from the sea or her. She stepped back out of the brine and swayed, and Jon reached without thinking and put his hand on her elbow, and she did not object to being the sort of woman who needed that for one breath. Viserion did not leap away. He stood and breathed. The breath made a sound that was not a hiss. It was not yet a purr. It was a rough sound of a creature teaching its lungs a different language. He opened his mouth and the blue in his throat did not gather. It flared and receded like shyness. He looked at Dany and then away and then back, the way a man looks at a child who has grown while he was not watching and is now making demands he does not understand but cannot disrespect. Come, Dany said, not a command, not even a request. Possibility. Viserion crouched. The earth complained. The frames sang, not because anyone blew into them, but because the air had been altered. He lowered his shoulder the way a horse does when it has decided to become useful. Dany's hand went to the ridge of horn as if it had never learned to be afraid. She placed her foot. Her weight went up slowly. No one breathed. She did not mount. She stood with one foot on the ground and one foot on her son and both hands on him, and the memory of all the skies she had learned and all the nights she had not slept living in her knuckles. She stayed like that long enough for the sea to change its mind twice. Then she stepped down. "Not today," she said, and the wind raised the hair at her temples as if in agreement. Viserion left the ground in his old contemptuous way. He did not take the sky with him. He allowed it to remain a place where others lived. He climbed with a dignity that was not anger. He went and was gone. Davos had to sit on the frame of the inner ring because his knees found his humor earlier than he did. Tamed put both hands on his belly and roared, as if all of it were his doing. Beric leaned his head back and closed his eyes and did not open them until someone offered him a skin. Sam sagged forward until his nose almost dipped in the brine and then jerked back with a noise of apology. Melisandre took her hand from Jon's arm and looked at her fingers as if to confirm they had done nothing foolish. "You gave him back a name," she said. "Not all of it. Enough to be returned tomorrow. That is all any of us are given," Davos muttered, looking at his breath as if surprised to find it his. They returned to Winterfell in a mood no one could agree upon. Sansa listened to the account with her head turned slightly, as if presenting a cheek to a gust. "We are building a language," she said at last. "Between you and him and Winter, languages cost. We will pay our share. The folk along the coast are starting to leave offerings at the tide line," Arya said with contempt that was only half contempt. "Shells, old knives, once a pie." "What sort?" Tormund wanted to know, instantly attentive. "Apple," Arya said without humor. "Good," Tormund said. "Let the sea get fat. It'll need the strength." At night, Jon sat with Bran in the Godswood and learned what you can learn in silence. There are lessons the body teaches itself when the tongue is quiet. He felt the edges of his own rooms. There were places in him he had not meant to lock. There were places he had barred properly. There were places that had no door and frightened him. Somewhere deep in his ribs, a scar answered the scar in the dragon. And when the wind came through the branches, the scars spoke across the gap like men signaling from hill to hill with mirrors. The next days belonged to bad news and laundry, to men swearing they had sharpened everything twice and women swearing the men had done it wrong, to a boy breaking his leg on the ice and laughing because he had never had a better reason to sit by a fire, to a girl who could throw a net better than her father and was not thanked for it and did it anyway. The dead came rarely and in small numbers. Winter conserved itself as an intelligent enemy will. It sent weather where men had plans. The plans had to learn to become weather too. On a morning that had frost like glass dust in the air and the sun bold as a pennant until a cloud cuffed it, a messenger came breathless from the north with his hair rimed and his message more so. There had been a thing like a storm at the edge of the world. It had not moved like a storm. It had not vented itself as storms do. It had gathered and then flickered and then gathered, and men on Skagos who had persuaded themselves to never be impressed had been. "Where?" Jon asked, and the man told him, and the line his finger made on the map ran like a vein that promised a heart. "We go," Dany said, voice even wrist steady. "We cannot bring the frame so far," Davos said, looking at the map as if it were tied. "We cannot bring the pipes. We can bring a memory of the sound and hope the air remembers its part." "We bring salt," Sam said, and flushed with his own audacity. "We bring dogs," Tormund added. "If the sea forgets to bark." They went because going is a habit. The road north was a piece of needlework done by a woman whose eyes had failed her. Stitches of the old path, then long gaps, then a brave attempt somewhere it did not belong. They made their own road when it insulted them. They were careful where the snow had turned to a crust that asked questions. They were louder where noise would tell the world they were not afraid of it and perhaps persuade it to waste its time. Ghost ranged and came back, and made of Jon's knee a post on a long journey with many such posts. Regal and Drogon carved their writing high up where no man could read it, and the sky pretended to be blank again when they were done. Dany rode and sometimes walked and sometimes stood with her face to a wind that was not sociable and taught the wind something. They found the thing that was not a storm on the 10th day. It swelled low on the horizon like a lie told by a man in a hurry. It did not tumble. It did not billow. It simply owned the space it had chosen and dared anything to tell it the rent was uncollected. The world around it had become obedient. The sea had quieted. The birds had taken themselves to the edges of their intelligence and perched there with their heads drawn in. Viserion moved inside it. He moved like a thought being thought very hard. "Keening glass or not," Davos said, "I will not go close enough to call that reasonable. We'll make our noise here and send it in as a gift." They set bowls. They poured brine and turned the bowls to catch a wind that was too well behaved to be entirely honest. They set 3 frames, small ones, traveling ones, that Sam swore would do if a man wanted it badly enough. They blew. The air protested and then allowed itself to be shaped. They blew until their mouths ached and their chests burned, and the noise became part of the landscape like a hill. Viserion came out of the edge of the knot storm as if he had misremembered what edges were for. He came at a slant and straightened and saw them and saw Dany and saw Jon, and something in him said, "Until when?" He landed with less contempt than usual and more care. The blue inside him brightened in an anxious way and then dimmed to let him see. Jon went into the rooms with his hands open. The Scar room had begun to hang pictures. That was absurd and true. Memory had ornamented itself with pieces of the world it was willing to keep. There was a sliver of shell. There was a length of chain, coiled, not dragging. There was a tooth, and beside it a man's handprint, not his, larger. The corridor of winter was the same and not the same. Its straightness had a flaw in it now, a place where the line wavered as if a person who had drawn it had sneezed and then convinced himself the mark was intended. At the far end, where weight was, there was a different kind of weight laid over it. Like a cloth draped on an altar one has ceased to worship and still cannot throw away. Jon did not go there. He put his hands on the scar, and the scar said, "Welcome," in the way stone says it by not moving. Dany stepped without hesitation. She placed her hand and then her head and then, after a long breath, her knee. She leaned against him as a woman leans against a kitchen table after the bread is in the oven and before the guests arrive. Her song was not a song. It was a line of air leaving and returning, the pattern that tells a body it is not alone. Melisandre's eyes closed. Her lips moved. What she said did not travel. It opened and closed entirely in her own mouth. The knot storm thickened, offended by theft. The dead at its edges shifted like salt in a spill that cannot choose which crack to commit to. Rhaegal and Drogon came low on either side and breathed and then broke away, not because they were ordered to but because the air ordered them to. Beric's blade woke and went to sleep twice without his hand altering. Davos muttered a sailor's creed about sheets and keels and lies. "Hold," Bran said, and the word now meant, "Hold steady on the wave you have. Do not try to ride a larger one yet." Something in Viserion's chest unclenched. It sounded like ice deciding not to argue with a spring for a minute. Jon felt it with his hands on the scar and with his hands on himself and with the part of him that was not hands. He let his shoulders drop 1 degree. He let his jaw find a place it had been offered and had not believed was real. "Do you remember?" Dany said, and the words left her mouth as if they had slept in it. "The orange one who bit Rhaegal's tail and then pretended not to know how to let go. Do you remember his eyes the day he saw snow for the first time?" The air beside Viserion's head trembled. He turned very slightly and looked into a distance that was not this one. Jon saw in the room the thing she spoke of. A small body with ridiculous dignity, a patch of color like a joke the gods had played and never confessed, the solemn idiocy of first snow. Viserion exhaled. A flake formed in the knot storm and fell and did not become weapon or weapon's idea. It landed on Dany's hair and lived a second and died a decent death. She closed her eyes and another fell on her lashes and she did not brush it away. Then the knot storm shifted from displeasure to doctrine. It rolled itself like a priest about to speak. The cold within it came sleek and cold as a knife that has never known a hand without money behind it. The edges of the dead sharpened. The bowls steamed hard. The frames complained and then lifted their thin argument another half step. "Enough," Bran said, and this time the word was heavy. Enough for today. John let go as a man unlatches a gate he has been leaning against to keep a bull out. He did it gently because he knew how much weight was behind the gate. Dany lifted her head with the slowness of a woman teaching herself how to leave and not break. Viserion stayed a heartbeat longer than he needed to. He took the sight of her like a man takes the scent of bread. He will not be offered, and then he left the ground and was Winter's problem again. They walked out of the noise. That is the only way to describe it. It clung for a while, as sounds do when they have decided to be more than air. Then it was behind them, and the regular, homely sounds of boots and harness and a man clearing his throat came back into the right sizes. That night the sky cleared at last, not as a mercy but as a change of subject. Stars appeared with the relief of guests who had been at the door too long. John stood under them and thought of the corridor and the cloth laid over the weight at its end. He thought of the small orange dragon and the first snow it had seen and the way living things insist on firsts as if their lives depended on gathering them. He thought of Dany's head on Viserion's jaw and the sound the Knotstorm had made when a flake had rebelled and been itself. He thought of the way Ghost pressed against him and then was not there and then was, the way a pulse is and is not if you put your fingers too lightly to your own throat. Sansa walked up beside him with a cloak over her hair and her hands under it like a woman keeping something brittle safe. Do not let the part of you that is Winter make promises for the part of you that is not, she said. Men forgive Winter for truths they would kill a summer man for. He turned his head and saw the line of her jaw strong under the fur. I don't know which part speaks most days, he confessed. That is what sisters are for, she said. We tell you which one it was and whether we have time to love you for it. Tonight we do. He smiled, small and rueful, and she did not know whether to like the expression and decided she did. Thank you, he said. For what? She asked. For counting the coins, he said. For keeping the ledger. She snorted. When this is over I will burn every ledger in the castle. I will feed the up with the ashes. Do not, he said, half serious. I will be lost without your lines. You will be lost with them, she said, and went back in without leaving tracks a man who did not know her could follow. News came that the dead had tested the Manderley net huts and found themselves tangled in exactly the way net huts are built to avoid but not forever. Men at White Harbor learned to pour salt in long lines like the edges of letters and then to walk those lines saying names out loud. Names of their own fathers and of fish and of dogs. It should have been nonsense. It worked, Melisandre visited and said, yes. As if approving of a child's handwriting, and Davos, standing at her shoulder, rolled his eyes like a man who had been in the temple kitchen and seen what actually kept the candles lit. Another week, another cliff, another argument with air. Viserion came and did not come and came. He allowed more and denied more. He taught patience and asked for it. Dany learned how to hold a hand on a cold jaw until her fingers forgot what heat was, and then learned again from Jon's palm around her wrists afterward. Jon learned to leave rooms closed and to hold open others with the strength of a man doing nothing, which is the rarest strength. It was not a line. It was not a ladder up which a man climbs. It was a tangle, and they moved through it until the sense of direction became something inside them that did not consult maps. Once, on a day when the air had a taste of iron and an eagerness for argument, Viserion curved and set his forefoot down just beside Dany's shoulder, a thing that would have crushed her if he had not meant the opposite. His claws sank in the snow with a sound of vowels. He looked down the line of his muzzle at her as if reciting a list of wrongs. She lifted her face and he did not burn it. She touched the ridge where horns met scale and then took her hand away as if retrieving a letter she had been allowed to read but not keep. The corridor at the back of the house dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed. Sometimes Jon thought he smelled mint in it. Nonsense. It was the memory of clean cold that had not yet been weaponized. Once he thought he heard the echo of feet far away that did not belong to anything living. He would have gone to the corridor then, except that Ghost's teeth were not on his sleeve. They were in his heart, gently, the way a wolf will hold a pup to keep it from wandering. On a night when the moon had failed to dig itself free of cloud and the hills lay like sleeping oxen along the edge of the world, the dead came to Winterfell itself to test the doors. They did not batter the gate. They asked questions of it. They touched the stones, and the stones were polite and did not answer. Arya stood on the parapet with a bow she did not draw. Sansa moved through the hall counting. Dany stood in the yard and did not look up when the shadows of men who had used to be men slid along the walls. Drogon and Rhaegal were south with the armies. Jon stood on the Godswood path with Ghost and listened to the quiet. The quiet did not break. The dead returned to the fields, having learned what they came to learn. Jon exhaled and saw it and did not apologize for it. In the morning he went to the cliff alone, without frames, without bowls, without men. That was foolish. He did it anyway. Ghost came because Ghost did. The sea was reflecting a sky that could not be pleased. He stood at the edge until vertigo suggested he step forward. He did not. He closed his eyes and knocked with the manners he had taught himself. The scar room opened without ceremony. The corridor lay quiet, the cloth at the far end heavier, as if someone had laid a second on top of the first. He put his hands on the scar and did nothing else. He waited. He learned that waiting is not absence but an act in itself. He waited until his knees told him he had been foolish and his breath told him the same in a different dialect. When he opened his eyes, Viserion was hovering, not landing, not gone, like a hawk deciding whether the glove held meat worthy of descent. The blue in him had grown less proud of itself. It had begun to accept that it lived in a world where other colors had names. He made a small, ugly sound and Jon felt it behind his teeth. "I know," Jon said out loud. "I know." The dragon tilted, so that one eye looked at him a fraction more than the other. He did not descend. He did not climb. He hung there, a weight suspended on a thread of will, and then he made a decision a man could not see and went. Jon laughed once. The raw laugh of a man told a joke by the world that was not funny but exact. And Ghost thumped his head against Jon's hip as if to scold him for thinking the cliff edge was improved by contemplation. He turned back toward Winterfell and found Dany on the path, cloak unfastened, hair wild as if it had fought the wind and decided to be friends with it. "You went without me," she said. "I went without everyone," he said. "You are not everyone," she said, and there was both comfort and accusation in it. "No," he admitted, and in the saying felt a relief he would not examine closely. He came. He did not land. She stepped beside him, their shoulders barely touching and colder for it, and walked back with him without a word, as if the silence were a cloak they could share and neither begrudged the other warmth inside it. Time went on doing the only thing it knows how to do. The dead gathered somewhere men were not. The living gathered where they could count themselves. The sea learned a new verse to its argument and sang it whenever anyone pretended not to listen. The brine bowls grew pitted with use. The frames acquired scars where men had repaired them on bad nights. The keening glass acquired a personality and sulked or sang as if it had an opinion about the weather. Then there came a day, morning hidden in cloud, when the wind had the sound of distant hooves. Jon could not name the reason the air felt rested, but it did. He went with Dany and with the few who had become arrangements of his days. Davos, Tormund, Beric, Sam, Melisandre, and they set nothing. They made no circle. They blew no glass. They stood by the sea and breathed and let the cold have its say. Viserion came low and slow and lame in a way that did not belong to body. He came as if carrying something new and not used to being a courier. He landed badly and hissed at the ground because there was no one else to blame. The blue in him softened and softened again as if at war with weather that had gotten inside his head and refused to leave politely. Dany stepped forward and put up one hand and he did not flinch and did not lean into it. He permitted his shadow to lie over her like a sheet not quite touching the bed. Jon went into the rooms and found the corridor dim. The cloth at the end hung heavy. He touched the scar and felt a protest, not from it, but from the winter beyond, the way a landlord protests when a door is shut that he had gotten used to keeping open. He stood his ground with all the impudence a mortal can muster. He is not supposed to be impudent. He was. Ghost's breath was at his thigh. Dany's song was only a breath, in and out, in and out. "Now," Bran said finally, but he had been saying it for a long time in another way, and now it meant, open the window for 1 moment and close it again before any flies learn the trick of getting in. Jon opened the window. The scar widened. The blue in the dragon's eyes trembled as if seeing through tears that refused to fall because they would freeze to needles and pierce. Viserion's head lowered. It lowered till his brow touched Dany's hair. The contact was clumsy and holy. She stood under it as if the ceiling had decided to be kind. "Home," she said. The word had too many meanings and all of them were true. Viserion lifted. He did not leave. He moved his head slowly along, touching her shoulder and her arm, not because he needed to know they were there, because he needed the act of knowing to be the same as the thing known. He made the small, ugly sound again and then another, and the second had a roughness that might one day sand itself into something men call contentment without understanding it. He stepped back. He planted one foreclaw near Jon's boot, and Jon did not move his foot, because a man who flees a gift deserves to never be given another. The claw's shadow crossed his boot like a signature. He put his hand out the way one offers it to a new dog that could remove it to the wrist and does not. He left it there in the cold, and the cold argued, and his hand argued back by being stubborn. Viserion's muzzle came down until the air was hot with his breath. Not the blue heat, the heat of a body insisting. Jon closed his eyes. His fingers skimmed scale. His palm found the edge of a ridge and did no more than acknowledge it was there. In the room with the scar smiled. "That is impossible." It happened. They stood like that until the sea decided it had not been allowed to speak for too long and grew louder. Viserion turned his head and looked out at it as if reminded that he had an appointment elsewhere. He looked back at Dany, and then the blue gathered, not to burn, but to signify. He leapt. He was sky again. Dany took one step after him and stopped herself. She was learning the parts of herself that believed in falling and those that did not. She turned to Jon and smiled a war's worth, small and unthreatening, and Jon felt something in him that had been winter too long decide to become something else. If not today, then soon. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. They walked back to Winterfell with Ghost weaving in and out as if knotting some old rope tighter. Above them the sky carried the writing dragons leave and then forget they have left. Below them the land went on in its business of pretending to sleep while moving everything that matters an inch per night. Late that night, the ravens in the rookery screamed in the clean, uncomplicated way birds do when they have seen something whose rules they cannot decode. Bran's eyes opened in his chair. He whispered something that was not a word. He whispered it again. Arya, waking in her room with a knife already in her hand, swore softly and, for once, was not smiling at having been given an excuse. Sansa, unable to sleep because ledgers have a way of muttering after men put them away, sat up and went to the window and put her hand to the cold and did not take it away. The storm that was not a storm had moved. It had not moved toward them. It had moved toward a place where men with bronze knives had once argued with trees and had lost and had been content about it. It had moved toward a weirwood grove that had not been cut because no man had the will to do it and live. It had moved toward a memory of a promise no one had written down. From the direction of Skagos came a light inside the darkness, not like blue, not like fire, like something trying to be blue and fire at the same time and not being allowed to. Jon felt it before anyone told him. He rose as a man rises to a child's cry. He did not run. Running would have been disrespect. He walked into the Godswood, and the heart tree knew what he had come to ask and did not refuse him. The rooms inside the dragon had emptied. Not of him, not of gold, not of the scar. Emptied of a particular pressure that had lived in the corners. The cloth at the end of the corridor hung heavier yet. There were 2, 3 now, weighed down by something like concern. The weight at the end of the corridor moved. It did not come closer. It acknowledged that a thing it controlled had made a choice it had not enjoyed and would punish later. It was not anger. It was bookkeeping. "Tomorrow," Bran said, from very near now, and his voice was less tree and more boy for a breath. "Yes," Jon said. He slept at last and dreamed of doors. Some were wide open with laughter spilling out. Some were shut and warm behind their panels. Some were merely frames waiting for doors to be built, and that might never happen, and perhaps that was for the best. He walked through a house that belonged to him and did not, and he was grateful to be allowed to. He woke before dawn, as men do when they are waiting on a thing that will happen with or without them, and went to the hall and drank a cup he did not want and accepted that his body would keep him company for as long as it could. When light came, it came grudgingly and with no affection for those who had asked for it. He gathered his cloak. Dany walked in without a guard with her hair half braided, as if she had begun and then remembered something better to do with her hands. Davos was already there with his scarf in his teeth and his right glove missing. Tormund yawned like a cave. Sam had left his book asleep and come to put his glasses on what the day would be. Melisandre said nothing. She had not said much since the moment under the knot storm when a flake had lived and died on Dany's lash. She looked at Jon now and nodded, and that was the entire cathedral of her consent. They went out to the yard. The air had that anxious smoothness it gets before weather decides to choose a quarrel. Arya stood above them and shut one eye as if sight argued with her and she had taken sides already. Sansa stood at the gate with her furs and her ledgers invisible but in attendance. Bran's chair was at the path's bend and the boys who pushed him stood behind as if he were pulling them and not the other way. They went to the cliff for the 20th time or the 30th. Counting had become superstition. They did not blow the frames. They did not set bowls. They stood and waited for a thing that is not bound by their wanting to decide it had something to say to them. Viserion came. He came with a new weight and without the crutch of a storm. He came not defeated and not triumphant. He came as a creature whose business had changed and was embarrassed to admit it. He landed with care. He made that ugly, honest sound. He lowered himself in the way a prince lowers himself when he is preparing to sit in a chair that has known his family and will continue to know it after he dies. Dany stepped forward and put her hand to his jaw and her brow to the place where scale is smoothest and the pulse of a dragon is a law, and she closed her eyes and did not sing. Jon went into the rooms. The Scar room was full of light that did not come from an obvious place. The corridor at the back of the house hung with cloth that smelled, absurdly, of clean linen and of snow and of the oil mothers put on children's hair when those children will not be comforted by anything else. The weight at the far end lay down. That was not victory. That was not surrender. That was a statement of endurance. Therefore I, who do not tire, will wait. You who do will fail in time. Jon acknowledged that arithmetic and did not argue with it. He placed both hands on the scar and said no. He did not say it out loud. He said it with his head and his hands and the animal that had decided to occupy his body for however long he was allowed. He said no with his breath. He said no with the patience of rooms learned and doors left shut. He said no with the absurd loyalty a man feels for a wolf and a queen and a dragon and a god he has never met. He said no without malice. He said no as a man says to an old friend who wishes him to go drinking when his child has fever. Another time, or never. Viserion breathed out. The breath was white. It hung and fell in little pieces like letters he might someday learn to read. Dany opened her eyes. Jon opened his. Ghost's tongue touched his knuckles as if to tell him he had hands again. Beric exhaled. Davos laughed under his scarf and folded his arms as if to keep his ribs from falling out. Tormund slapped his own belly and declared himself king of something. Anything. Everything. Sam wept without fuss and then stopped and wiped his face with the back of his glove and pushed his glasses up his nose with a finger he did not want anyone to see trembling. Home, Dany said again, testing whether the word would break underfoot. It did not. Viserion did not bow. He did not kneel. He lowered the ridge of his neck and made a space that was neither saddle nor bench nor trap. Dany put her foot there because there are moments where a person must behave as if grace were an ordinary convenience or risk losing it. She put her other foot and rose to the low place where a rider rides who is not yet trusted and is not yet trusted herself. She stood. She did not sit. She put her hand to the ridge and felt the rough under her palm and let the rough teach her how to be. Viserion lifted them a hand's breadth and lowered them and lifted them again and lowered them. He moved his weight forward in the way a man rocking a cradle does to remind the body inside it that the world contains patterns you can depend on when everything else is lie. He did it again. Dany's breath went out in a small laugh that she did not mean to make and could not have stopped if she'd tried. She looked down at John, and the laugh lay warm on her lip for a moment, and the cold took it and could not entirely claim it. "Tomorrow," John said, and this time the word had weight and promise combined, the dangerous alloy that men have lived and died making. "Tomorrow," Dany said, and the sea, affronted not to be consulted, threw a wave and then pretended it had meant to in any case. They stepped down. Viserion lifted and was air and wrote a sentence across the sky that meant nothing and everything. The dead did not come to object. The storm that was not a storm did not arrive to claim breach of contract. The day stood up and stretched and pretended it had always been willing to be reasonable. Winter does that sometimes when no one is watching. They walked back. Winterfell waited with the patience of stones, of ledgers, of wolves asleep but not quite. Sansa stood in the gate and did not smile and did not scowl, and then, when she had decided no one was looking who would misunderstand, she smiled. Arya on the parapet held out one hand to feel if the air had changed and then nodded an inch as if satisfied with a day's work. Bran's eyes followed a raven that had decided to alight on a chimney and sit in its own smoke. Davos clapped his hands together once, as if dusting flour from them, and went to inspect stores because that is what a man does when miracles begin to think themselves sufficient. Jon went to the Godswood at dusk because habit is how a man asks for his life to continue. The heart tree watched him. Ghost lay with his head across Jon's boot as if pinning him to the earth. The air smelled of iron and old resin and the inch of thaw that had tried to happen at midday and had been corrected. He did not ask the tree for anything. He did not have the impudence. He put his hand to the bark and let the bark notice him and decide whether to keep any part of him later. Viserion moved far away, a shadow that belonged to no one and to him, and the corridor at the back of the room hung with linen and winter both, and the weight lay there and did not move, and that was fine. Behind it all stood a name that had learned to answer in the same breath it was called, and a scar that had learned to be something more than absence, and a woman who had learned to laugh in winter without wasting heat, and a wolf who had learned nothing because he had always known all of this in his fashion. Night came on with its proper business. Men ate. Women spoke. Fires leaned into their chimneys and argued with smoke and smoked men into agreeing with them. The moon rose and declined and a star fell in the west and no one saw it. Jon sat until his fingers grew too cold to continue being noble about it, and then got up and stamped and went to where bread would be and breathed the simple grace of warm air inside walls. Tomorrow, he thought, and the word did not frighten him. It should have. It did not.